Hey everyone, it is Jaime Jo Wright here at Madlit Musings, and like normal, I hit record after about 20 minutes of conversation because we're just having so much fun here today. So I have with me Eva Marie Everson and her cohort in writing crime, Miriam Feinberg Vamosh. And we have Miriam who's coming to us from Israel. And Eva, I didn't even ask where you were. But I'm in Wisconsin.
I'm on the moon half the time.
You're on the moon. Okay, so the moon, Israel, and then northern Wisconsin.
No, I live in Central Florida, house of the mouse. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. So we've got people from all over, and we decided to gather today because we wanted to chat about your new book, your release. It's been out for a little while. I'm probably not going to say it quite right, but I'm going to try. It's called a Hoti.
Very good.
Did I do it right?
A Hoti.
Hoti. Yeah, it's Hebrew, right? And so you're trying to get a little bit of that phlegm in my throat. Yeah, I tried my
Insert
best.
phlegm here. This is what Miriam always says to me. Insert phlegm here.
I love it. I love it.
Nobody ever said that, though, off the cuff.
I think it's great. Insert phlegm here. That should be like a hashtag for anybody taking Hebrew classes. Like insert phlegm here.
Or phlegm here. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can just run a search on that, and then you just know all the words that you have to really have that built up in your
we should
throat.
Start this, Miriam.
See?
Absolutely.
See? I'm trying to help you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I'm from Wisconsin, where we can't even say the word bag right, because apparently you don't.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine from Idaho the other day, and
yeah,
I got tickled because she was what we say roof, like that thing over the house.
Yeah,
and it was roof, or something.
Yeah,
it sounded more like a dog was barking.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
it's so funny how we're speaking the same language, but we say things differently.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Yeah,
it's a big country, and even in Israel there are regional accents. There's a different accent for Jerusalem than the rest of the country.
Oh, really?
Slightly different in certain, very few, but certain words. There or games that they played. One of the games that's been played since Bible days. The Jerusalemites call it one thing, and everybody else calls it something else.
How cool is that? That's so cool. I love it. Vernacular and terminologies and all that. Like even the word here, and not to get off on this because we want to talk about your book, but I was talking with somebody who lives down south, and we were talking about soda pop.
Oh yeah.
And Coke, and here in Wisconsin it's pop.
Oh yeah.
And she was like, "Why would you call it pop?" And I'm like, "I don't know. That's what you call it." And she was like, "You call it Coke." And I'm like, "Well, how do I know if I want a Coke or a Pepsi if you call it all Coke?" She goes, "You say I want a Coke, and then you explain what brand you want." And I'm like, "This is confusing."
Yeah. Well, because Coke originated in Atlanta, Georgia. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I'm a Georgia girl. I was born and reared in Georgia, and so so we know what Coke means, and it's different. If you're going to get specific, then you'll say, I'd like a Coke. What would you like? A knee high, or
a knee high. What's a knee high?
It's like it comes in orange and grape and strawberry. It's kind of like a Fanta.
Oh, I've never heard of a knee high.
Yeah.
Okay.
Knee high. Yeah. Yoo-hoo. Yeah.
The things we learn when podcasts are unscripted and we don't launch into like predefined questions. There's a danger to it. All right, so let's talk about your book, though. I have all kinds of questions, but I do know that this is the story of, and I'm going to say it wrong because this is how I learned it in Sunday school, was Tamar, which is probably really wrong, but Tamar. It's her, Tamar.
How wrong can you go? But it's actually Tamar.
Yeah.
Tamar.
Yeah.
Well, I blame my childhood Sunday school teacher. I'll write her a letter. You taught me wrong. This wasn't even biblical. Okay, so it's the story of Tamar, who is a daughter of King David, if I remember my biblical history correct. And this is her fictionalized story after the events that occurred that are written in Scripture. Am I correct?
Correct.
All right. So my big question, and either one of you can go and answer, how did this book come about? And you co-wrote it. So there's just all kinds of interesting things I'm sure you have to tell us. So tell us everything. We want to know.
Let's say I guess Eva, you can expand on this later because you tell so wonderfully. You tell everything wonderfully.
Oh, thank you.
Eva's part of the story is that she came to Israel. I was a tour guide for many years, and I wrote a itinerary based on one of my books on women in the Bible and the tourism ministry. Eva came as a journalist to hear about and that's how we met originally. We wrote one book together with, which I'll also let Eva tell about because that was her baby, and she brought me in on it.
Awesome.
And this book, I had in mind for a few years to write it. I was given the idea by the man who was the content advisor on my book about children in the Bible. He's a biblical and Talmudic scholar his name is Professor Meir Bar Ilan. And I didn't really know much about him except that what I just said. And that I found him on the internet because I saw he had an interest in children, and he agreed to be my advisor on the children's book.
Sure.
And at the dinner meeting or the celebration when we launched the book, he leaned over and said to me, I have a story to tell, and I think you're the one to tell it.
Oh.
Well, it turned out that he is the greatest living authority, living or dead. It's a very obscure manuscript that originated in India. I can tell you more about it as we go along.
Absolutely.
Originated perhaps in the land of Israel, I correct myself, and then came to Yemen, eventually came to India. And from there, in the 19th century, it ended up in the Cambridge University Library in the UK, all through the agency of Christian pastors or church leaders, people in those days, late 19th century. They were fascinated by the possibility of where were the 10 tribes and the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And this particular, the head of the Scottish church, Claudius Buchanan was his name. He was the first to realize that this was something very special. It's a book called The Words of Gad the Seer. And it is mentioned in the Bible.
I was going to say.
Yes, sounds familiar. 1 Chronicles 29. It mentions this and this and this are all in the words of Gad the Seer.
And Nathan the prophet.
Yes. And it turns out that this was a real book. We assume they were all real books at one time, but we don't know what happened to most of them. Here comes this book that Professor Bar Ilan came across in the Cambridge University Library, and he did the definitive study on it. It had been studied here and there, but most people thought it was either medieval or modern. And anyway, to get to the point, one of the chapters in that book is about Tamar, David's daughter. And what the author, Gad the Seer, did was to take the very brief and tragic telegraphic story in the Bible and expand on it. And a whole bunch of events happened to Tamar in the reading of this author. And that's the story that Professor Bar Ilan wanted me to tell.
Wow.
And now, so I said, okay, I'll do that. I mean, that took me a few years to really say, can I do that? I had only ever written one fiction book before, but my other books are nonfiction. And I called upon Eva that we were in touch all through the years. And I knew she coached writers. And I thought I'd just ask her a question or two, but she turned out to be so helpful that she was just amazing. She jumped on it right away. She understood what I was doing. She was able to add so many important elements, especially about the inner life of the characters. That eventually when our publisher asked if Eva would sign on as co-author, I welcomed that because she deserved it every which way, any which way. So that's
there's the story.
Well, that's quite a story. I mean, that brings back not to be insulting, but when you're watching movies of like National Treasure or the Da Vinci Code, all of those are
Yeah.
fictionalized,
Yes.
obviously, but that there's something inside of us that you want to discover these lost manuscripts or these lost archaeological elements that can be supported by history and authenticated.
Yes.
And granted, Gad the Seer's book isn't necessarily part of scripture or the inspired word of God, but it's the closest you can get to an actual historical account of what happened, and that it's preserved is just goosebumps moment.
Yes,
Goosebump moment.
Right.
Goosebumps.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that we know that scroll upon scroll upon scroll, book upon book upon book were written. Not everything was canonized, but these things were written, and they are mentioned, like in the chronicles of this, in the chronicles of that, and so we don't always know where those chronicles landed. Where did they go?
Right.
So and for me, when Miriam brought the story to me, and my love has always been Old Testament theology. I have immersed myself in it. Miriam and I actually have a joke about that because Miriam led Christian tours for so many years. She actually knows the Christian New Testament better than the Jewish Old Testament. And because I have immersed myself in the Old Testament,
that's so funny.
I know the Old Testament. And so we have laughingly said, as a Jew, as a Jewish woman, she knows the New Testament scriptures. As a Christian woman, I know the Old Testament scriptures. And it's
I kind of love that irony.
It is ironic,
because to me, that's just a picture of what Christ intended to happen. Where it's the merging of Gentile and Jew sometimes to becoming just the one branch of Christ. And I just love that. That's so cool. Oh, more goosebumps.
Well, because we forget sometimes that every word, hello, Christians out there, every word was written by Jewish men, right?
Yeah.
So we forget that sometimes. But anyway, I started looking at what she was bringing to the table of like, this is what this document says.
Yeah.
And then looking at that one little chapter that we have about Tamar and say, well, wait a minute. The woman didn't die when the door shut on her.
No.
So what happened? And then as Miriam and I literally would take this is what the words of Gad the Seer says. And now this is what the scripture says, and going, wait a minute. So I think our biggest aha moment was when we got to the very, very beginning. After she is raped by Amnon, her half brother, she comes up on Absalom, her whole brother, who we know fights for the crown.
Right.
From the minute we meet him, he wants that crown. And he says to her, this is scriptural, this is in the Bible. He says to her, what's wrong? Has your brother Amnon been with you? And I said to Miriam, what? Why has that never jumped out at me before? With all the men in the palace, why Amnon?
Why Amnon?
Unless he knew. Unless he was a part of it. And that is what this document indicates.
Okay.
And in fact, we could say that I came across this idea in the actual how many sentences? It's 13 verses, right, Eva?
Right.
Or 15 verses, the story. And as I was doing my study on it, I came across a few articles that suggested, because of what you just said, Eva, that this was a plot, a conspiracy against Tamar. And that was an eye-opening moment. And that, of course, led us to be able to build on that.
Right.
And
because she as a woman would have been expendable.
And then
and why would you waste time having a conspiracy on a woman at that point? Like, what was the threat? What did she bring to the table that created a threat?
Thank you so much for asking that, because people rightly understand or realize that women in Bible times did not have all the rights that men had.
Right.
But women to put it mildly, and of course we could go on and on with that, but I'll stop.
Right.
But women in the aristocracy, and I'll just add this, that in the Bible, we often find the female figures working behind the scenes, using their words to actually change history.
Right.
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 And so the women acted behind the scenes, and they were the court was led to believe that Tamar was somehow involved in this supposed conspiracy, even though she obviously was not. She was a victim, but that's what the court was led to believe, according to one or two scholars.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the women
Because
did
she wanted her brother to get the
to
crown.
be on the throne. Yes. She
Okay.
wanted her full brother to be on the throne.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Eva.
Yep.
And so, the Gad the seer goes through a whole bunch of stuff that happens to her, and eventually she gets justice.
Mhm.
We
Okay.
won't say how necessarily,
Right.
but in another place, in another time. And our challenge was what to do with Tamar for about 20 years.
Oh, yeah, because you have a span of time there where a lot,
Yes.
and a
so,
lot happens in that span of time.
yeah, so I was able to, because of my knowledge of the country,
Okay.
I was able to bring her from one place to another and talk about things that happened there. But Eva, for example, Eva was the one to point out, among many other things, the story of Dina, or Dinah, you probably call her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And her rape. And Eva said, well, we have to, if I'm inventing this, correct me, Eva, we have to put in the rape of Dina somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made up the idea that on this 20-year journey to justice, she stopped at Shechem, which you may have called Shechem.
Mm-hmm.
And Tamar stopped there in our imagination. And then that way we were able to bring in the story of Dina or Dinah.
Okay.
And on with things that Eva was able to put in that really enriched the plot enormously.
Yeah.
Well, we had a lot of fun with, as we're trekking across the country with her, because we wanted her to get to the land of her grandfather. Her mother was a princess. And so that was the thing. I mean, as a princess, she was a commodity. She, she would have had value to her father. And I
she was a virgin.
Because she was a virgin. And so I think that David's anger was not so much at Amnon as the fact that he had lost his commodity.
That's right.
How am I going to make a deal?
Sure.
And so we realized, okay, well, she would have been going through Abel. And so we started looking at this story of Miriam said, well, we have the story about the wise woman of Abel. And so we started reading this story. And in this story, this wise woman of Abel, who was never named, goes up on the roof, basically the pinnacle of, of the wall around it, and looks down and sees David's commander, who was his cousin, I believe, Joab, right? And she calls him by name. So I said to Miriam, whoa, how did she know who he was? And maybe it was Tamar, who knows, so it made sense that we could turn this wise woman of Abel, we could blend their stories. And so we did. And we're not saying that she was the wise woman of Abel, but just so interesting that whoever this woman, smart woman that she was, she knew who Joab was. She called him by name. She didn't say, hey, you, commander. She literally calls him by name. And she had this innate understanding that he was a tough guy, you know? And he was. I mean, he killed, in the end, he killed Absalom. So, even though David told him not to.
Right. Wow.
Such a time.
That's a lot. It's so interesting because, obviously this is a fictionalized account based off of archaeological evidence and documentation. So reading the story is a possibility of what might have happened, not an actual, this is what happened. However, it is always interesting to me, like even as a child, when I would read the Old Testament stories, they would always be so short. And I would always have this feeling like, there's gotta be so much more, you know? And for whatever reason, the Lord didn't expound like a fictionalized author in the Bible on all of those. He didn't give us like an entire book of Tamar. But And it's always
Not enough
interesting.
papyrus.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. Unfortunately, they didn't have computers back then and all that. But, it's interesting when you read novels, especially ones that are well researched with archaeology and such put in it, to learn the what could have beens, or even the things that would have definitely influenced, like you were mentioning, like her being a princess and being a commodity and all those things. You don't necessarily know that unless you've done all the historical research.
Absolutely. And that's where Miriam is such a blessing for anyone who is working on something like this, because not only, this is her history, this is our history, but this was her life. I mean, she knows. I often said, if there's a rock in Israel, she doesn't know the rock doesn't exist. Somebody brought the rock in instead of taking the rock out, because there's so many pebbles, I'm sure, that have gone.
All right, so I need to go to Israel and bring a little rock from Wisconsin and set it down and be like, can you tell which one's not this? Not which one doesn't belong?
I was also, I also had my work cut out for me to not only look up, let's say, things about Shechem, or other places that are well known for decades to the archaeologists, but a place like Abel, which is figures centrally in our story, is only now being excavated over the past maybe 7-10 years. And so I was really able to, I just cold called everybody I needed, the woman who's excavating at Abel, and I said to her that one of the elements of the story that I wanted to say about the life in Abel in those days, and I said, can I put this in because I read that you discovered this and this? She said yes to the one thing I wanted. She said, we did discover that, but it's not from the period you're talking about.
Darn.
So, it put me back on the right path.
Right, right. Well, so and it's comforting to know as a reader, too, that authors such as yourselves who are taking biblical characters or biblical stories, you're not just necessarily fabricating all the cultural facts around it to fit the story, so knowing that you're calling the archaeological sites, the experts, the ones that have been involved in it, adds credibility to, the cultural elements that you're putting in the fiction, which is so important.
Yes.
Well, even deciding that Tamar was a healer of sorts, because why else would David have called on her to make this special bread, if that is what it was, because there is some, chit chat about what that word actually means.
Sure.
Bira, or is that correct, Miriam? Bira?
Biria.
Okay.
Biria.
That was one of the many words that Eva wanted me to use in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And go ahead,
I kept
Eva.
saying, okay, we need to use the Hebrew word here.
So you were saying, go ahead, Eva.
Yeah. So, it's like that's part of what we do as fiction writers is we look at one thing and we say, well, what if, and if then, and so if David was asking her to do this, then obviously she understood the healing qualities of herbs and spices and this and that. So she had some general understanding of it. So that is where we put her great interest was in these healing herbs and spices and things like that. So, Miriam did a mountain of research on all of that. And even,
I had some of it on file because I had written a book about food at the time of the Bible.
Oh, okay.
And so I knew something about it, but I dove into it for this purpose. And I have to give a shout out to Paraclete Press because I'm very interested in the spices and the traditional healing and all that.
Yeah.
And I put it in there, but the graphics people at Paraclete Press picked on their own, had the idea to pick a different spice that was, or herb actually, usually, that was mentioned in that section or that chapter, do a picture of it at the top of a drawing of it at the top of that chapter.
That's neat.
And
so everyone is different. Yeah,
I was astounded by that they picked up on that, and I was so encouraged.
Yeah, Yeah,
but that
that
didn't
is
mean that much to them.
that is really neat.
Yes.
And you do, I mean, that's a whole other conversation too, but you even look at biblical times and the spices and the herbs and the things that they used. I mean, even now I have friends every now and then they'll be like, we just decided to try this because nothing else is working,
Right.
in the medical field, and not to get off on that, but in different things. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, I
Oh,
have a
look at
friend
that.
whose husband went through an amputation and he had an infection and nothing was working in the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, she ended up using that really rich honey,
I knew it.
Yeah.
I knew that's
Yeah.
and applied it, and within a day or two it was
yeah,
already starting to heal, and the doctors were like, oh my goodness, and she's like, it's not rocket science, it's been
yeah,
around since the
It's
beginning
been
of time.
around. God gave us all of this. He
Yeah.
gave us all of this.
Yeah.
We're the ones who wanted to add chemicals and all of that,
Right.
to it. But it just, like I said, this enabled us to enrich Tamar's character
Yeah.
even more.
Yeah.
Because every town she goes to, as she's traveling along over a 15-year period, she is able to, use this great talent
Right.
that she has to help people.
Right. Okay, so I have a question, and it might be a little bit of a touchy one, so you can say I prefer not to answer. But I wanted to talk about Tamar and the fact that her story sort of begins in scripture after being raped. And rape today in our culture has quite a bit of stigma attached to it, to the point where a lot of women still keep it secret. They don't even go get medical assistance, etc. So, and that's in an era now, in a culture now, where women have, I would say, a great more independence and ability to assert themselves than they necessarily would have back in the time of Tamar. So how does being a woman who was virginal is raped, how would that affect her life, and the people around her? Because obviously she's in a place of being there's a doggy, yay, yeah, that's how it affects her, very angrily.
Daisy has something to say.
She has something to say. But how did that work culturally as a woman in those times?
I'm going to let Eva answer most of that, but I'll just say that I'll just say that when I thought about it, and Eva helped me enrich this a lot, it was my assumption that a woman then and a woman now basically respond to the act itself, to the violence itself, the same way. And the difference between now and then is that the surrounding culture we've come a long way.
Yeah.
And the surrounding culture doesn't see rape as this, hopefully, as the stigma. I'm hedging it and hedging it and hedging it, but we have come a long way.
Right.
It's not like in the Bible, there's a rule that says, or a law that says, if a woman is raped in the town, in the village, if a woman is raped in the field, then she isn't stoned or punished in any way, because even if she cried out, nobody could hear her.
Right.
But if she was raped in the city, she and the rapist would be punished, because she could have cried out and she didn't. So today, this is an anathema to say, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you cry out? Etc. So I assumed that that's a lot of talk from me, saying that I was going to have Eva answer most of it.
That's okay.
No,
That's
you're
all right.
fine.
Turn it over to Eva right now, because Eva has a great deal to add to this.
Well, here's Tamar had certain laws that she could depend on in this moment. And one of them was to say, don't do this wicked thing. Let's go to our father David, because they were half brother and sister.
Right.
And as Miriam knows, even Abraham and Sarah were a half brother and sister.
You told me that.
Yeah, there's the joke. There's the joke, Jaime Jo. Was I happened to mention that one day, and she says, "What are you talking about?" So Tamar is trying to use every bit of intellect and wisdom that she has, and the laws that would have protected her in this moment. whether she would have ever wanted to go through with this, and probably even thinking, probably my father will say no, or our father will say no, because hey, I'm the commodity. I can, I can connect us to another land, another country, culture, or whatever. So he'll probably just say no. I'll find you another wife. Just go back to your chamber. and so, but it didn't work out that way for her. And so what is so upsetting is that when she comes up on Absalom, or he comes up on her, and she has she has torn this beautiful robe that her father gave her and poured the ashes on her head. He says to her, don't tell anybody. Just, and he's like, I'll handle this, and just go away and just go on with your life, and doesn't address that issue of even saying to her maid, help her, get her cleaned up, help her do this. And of course, I believe, now that I've studied it in more detail, I really believe that he thought that if he went to David and said, Amnon raped my sister, that David would then kill Amnon, or at least kick him out of the running. And then Absalom would be the next king, and he didn't do that. So 2 years goes by, and that's a lot when you're steaming. And then he kills Amnon, and now he's got a bounty on his head. And it's just, what a mess. But here's, and we go back again. Nathan told David, your family's going to be a mess. Because of this thing that you did, because you took that little ewe lamb, from Uriah. And, but not only, and I'm always very careful about, how I say it, because I don't consider myself a victim. I consider myself a victor. But when the Me Too movement came out, I was like, well, yeah, me too, Sure. But being able to pour some of the old feelings that I had into Tamar, and saying, but this is how you would feel, and et cetera, et cetera. But then also because I worked in the rape crisis center, as a volunteer and that kind of thing. And so, having some of those experiences, I don't think women have changed that much. I still think that by and large, we will put on a mantle of shame. Like we did something wrong. Because we will either talk ourselves into I shouldn't have worn that. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have been here. I shouldn't have been there. Whatever. And where my thing is for me, that was a moment in your life. Now move on, get the healing that you need and move on. You are still of value. You didn't do anything wrong. Even though I can look back and say, oh, I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have. So when we did this with Tamar, for me, it was almost cathartic, because she didn't stay in Absalom's house and hide. She went on to do great things.
According to Gad the seer, which is one of the most amazing things about this manuscript, which is at least many centuries old, maybe thousands of years, is that Gad the seer's idea was to give her justice and healing. And was he the only person in those days who realized that a rape victim needed to have justice and healing? Maybe he was the only person to write about it.
Maybe.
It's so long ago. But now it's something that we're all working through as a society, wherever we live, wherever we live in the world. And what Eva's mantra, almost, that you are not a victim, you are a victor, is just terrific.
You survived it.
To survive this.
You survived it.
It's so much meaning for us today. And we have to thank the anonymous Gad the seer, who told us that story about a biblical figure that is not part of the Bible.
Right.
I mean, the door just shuts on her,
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And she lived. I mean, she kept going.
She didn't die when the story ended. So, yeah. So much to be still discovered it. And, I tell my kids as we're talking about Bible stories, even now, I'm like, there's a lot of things I look forward to in eternity. There's a lot of reunions of loved ones that I look forward to, but there are some people on my list that are going to be next in line that I'm going to be like, okay, so you got 3 verses. I need more than 3 verses now. Like, fill me in on everything that we don't know and what was the real story.
Can I get you a coffee? Because we
exactly. But the scriptures are so rich of stories, and then all the untold pieces that we don't even know. And it's always made more rich when you start understanding cultural implications of the time, historic implications of the time, regional, everything that we've talked about today. It just makes these stories come alive in such a neat way. So,
well, one of the things that I love with Miriam is because there's so much that has been told, excuse me, and not necessarily written down.
Right. Yeah. Lots to discover, lots to find out, and archaeology keeps discovering things too, which is super exciting. And he was trying to just drink that coffee, girl. Drink it down. I was on a podcast once and I was coughing so hard I was crying. It was beautiful. And there was no way to edit it out. So I'm like, oh, well, this is where we're at.
Water.
That's good. All right. So the book is pronounced a Hoti. And I should ask real quick before I call out where we can find it and everything. What is the significance of that name?
Oh, well, again, when we were thinking, I give all credit to Eva for this because Eva we were thinking what would we call the book, Tamars Story or the story of Tamar, whatever. Sure. Eva said, call it a Hoti, which appears frequently in the text in our book, because people would normally, siblings would normally, or not necessarily, call each other by name. Even my brother who also lives in Israel, when if I call him up, he picks up the phone and says, Ahoti.
Oh.
Or it's kind of like bro, but it's your actual.
Sure. Yeah. Like, bro.
My sister. My late sister, when she visited Israel, and one of the few Hebrew words she knew was Ahoti, because people would say, "Who is this?" And I'd say, "Ahoti, my sister." So that became part of the book. And Eva said, "Well, we should call it that." And I said, "Eva, people aren't going to know even how to pronounce it. We got Ahati." In fact, he was, but that's not the thing.
He might have been.
We got Ahudi. As if he was a rebel from Yemen. And we got all kinds of things until, sure enough, Eva was right. People made the effort, like you did before we started, to know how to pronounce it correctly, to give respect to the character and the language and culture and everything else.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was a great thing you did, Eva.
Well, thank you. I also think that the title bonds us all as women, because we are all sisters. And for anyone who has been subjected to any type of physical assault, that even bonds you even more. It's like a band of brothers in the army and that kind of thing, But we are all Hoti, and we are all sisters, and we are bonded, I believe, by this story in such a beautiful way. Not only because of this injustice that was done to her, but the justice that came afterward in her own making. Because, if this document is correct, she said, oh, no. And she struck out on her own and became a very independent woman, kind of like a Deborah,
There we go.
Judge Deborah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very independent.
The book is available pretty much where all books are sold. And it looks like you can get it on Kindle, you can get it on audio, and paperback. So you guys have every corner covered for every reader.
Yes.
Did you see who our voice actress was?
I did not.
You did not. Yasmin Alami from The Chosen. She plays Raymond.
Yes.
So I was so tickled when I saw that, because I'm a huge Chosen fan. And I know Jerry Jenkins, and I had asked him if he would endorse the book, and he did. And when I sent that into Paraclete, giving them the props again, Paraclete said, "Oh, well," and they called Jerry would you ask Dallas if one of the girls on the show would like to be the reader, the voice actress?
Awesome.
And Yasmin, raised her hand. So
that's so cool.
She did a fabulous job.
That's awesome.
Just fabulous. She did the whole accent and everything.
Well, see, now I want to listen to the audiobook version because then it really makes you feel like you're there.
Oh, yeah. I listened to it while I was walking, and I was, I forgot about that.
I know,
this was how many years ago we worked on this.
It's so funny too when you write a book and then it's published. And then one day I was reading a quote that somebody had posted from a book. I wasn't paying attention to the book. I was just reading the quote. I'm like, wow, that's actually a really insightful thing. And then I just paid attention to the book and I'm like, oh, I wrote that. Oops.
Oh, I wrote that.
And then you're like, no wonder it resonates with me because it came from my own brain. I'm probably like me and this person who posted are probably the only two it resonated with. But yeah, it's great.
Right. Yeah, I know sometimes I'll read something that, is in one of my books and I'll say, wow, I wrote that. Coming out of me, but we go into the zone,
Yeah, you
so
do.
We don't.
You do.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, this has been
brilliant.
You are. You're just a genius, Eva. This is awesome. Well, this has been so much fun. It's been such a blast to get to know both of you, to learn more about the culture, the times, the story of Tamar. And if people want to look it up, you can find it on Amazon. That's probably your easiest, but there's Christian book distributors and other places. And check it out. See what you think. Learn a little bit about the times and of the story of Tamar. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Toda rabah.